A quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind with trimmed lawns and white fences, seemed like the perfect escape for Michael. A military veteran seeking peace. But beneath the calm surface, a storm was brewing. It started with little notes in the mailbox, whispers about rules, sideways glances at his loyal golden retriever Ranger, who wore his service vest like a badge of honor. Most neighbors smiled at the dog, but one woman, the HOA president, saw him as a violation, a threat to the order she believed she alone was meant to protect. Her name was Karen, and her obsession with control was about to cross a line no one in that cul-de-sac could have imagined. One afternoon, what began as petty harassment turned into something violent and cruel, an attack that would leave the community stunned, a service dog injured, and Karen herself dragged into a federal courtroom. This is the story of how one entitled neighbor discovered that abusing power doesn't just cost you respect. Sometimes it costs you your freedom. Michael had never been the kind of man who sought out drama. After years of military service, he wanted nothing more than to build a life of calm routine, far away from conflict. He carried himself with quiet dignity, the kind of steady presence that comes from discipline. But like many veterans, Michael also carried scars, not always visible, but deeply felt. Crowded spaces triggered waves of panic. Sudden noises could snap him back to memories he'd rather leave behind. What made life bearable, what made it possible to step outside and live among people again, was Ranger, his golden retriever service dog. Ranger wasn't just a pet. He was trained to recognize Michael's anxiety before it spiraled out of control. He knew how to nudge Michael back to reality with a paw, how to press his weight against him during moments of dizziness, and how to stand guard in crowded places to carve out just enough space for breathing. Ranger's vest, bright red and stitched with bold white letters reading "Service Dog, Do Not Pet," made it clear he wasn't a toy, but a working partner. Yet his calm eyes and steady presence made him loved by nearly everyone who met him. When Michael moved into the cul-de-sac, he thought he had found the ideal place to heal. The houses looked almost identical, white-trimmed, neat driveways, flower beds blooming with impatiens and roses. Kids rode bicycles along the sidewalks, and sprinklers clicked across manicured lawns. It felt like a slice of peace after years of turbulence. He noticed the HOA rules tucked into the welcome packet: lawn height restrictions, exterior paint codes, garbage bin placement. Nothing unusual, nothing he couldn't live with. At first, everything was quiet. Michael walked Ranger each morning, neighbors waved, and children sometimes asked if they could say hello to the golden retriever. Michael would politely explain the rules about not petting him while he was in vest, but he always offered a kind word. For the first few months, he allowed himself to believe he had found a community that would accept him as he was. That illusion shattered the day he met Karen. Karen was the HOA president, a woman in her mid-50s with a sharp blonde bob, pastel cardigans that matched the season, and a clipboard that seemed permanently attached to her hand. She carried herself like royalty on her suburban throne, striding down sidewalks with the authority of someone who thought she was protecting her kingdom. To her, the rules weren't just guidelines, they were sacred texts, and she decided almost instantly that Michael and Ranger were a problem. It began subtly. Karen would stop Michael during his walks, pretending casual conversation, while her eyes drilled into the vests strapped around Ranger. She asked pointed questions. Is that dog really necessary outside your home? Or what happens if he scares a child? At first, Michael responded patiently, explaining Ranger's training and legal protections, but Karen never seemed satisfied. Her smile was thin, her tone coated with disapproval. Then came the letters. At first, they were framed as reminders. A folded notice tucked into his mailbox, reminding him of community decorum. Soon the notices turned into official warnings, accusing him of allowing a large, intimidating animal in common spaces. Michael sent back copies of the Americans with Disabilities Act, highlighting the passages that protected service dogs. He thought that would end it. But Karen wasn't interested in the law, she was interested in control. Other neighbors began noticing her fixation. At HOA meetings, she brought up Ranger with thinly veiled irritation, suggesting that exceptions set dangerous precedents. She claimed she had received complaints from worried parents, though no one seemed willing to admit being the source. Parents who had once smiled at Ranger now looked hesitant, caught between their admiration for the dog and Karen's persistent narrative of fear. Karen's campaign grew bolder. She snapped photos of Ranger on his walks, emailed them to board members with captions like, "Possible violation." She told anyone who would listen that the dog was aggressive, despite the fact that Ranger had never done more than wag his tail and lean into Michael's leg. Slowly, neighbors who had been friendly began to withdraw. Invitations to barbecues dried up. People waved less often. It was as though Karen's disapproval hung over Michael like a storm cloud, infecting the atmosphere of the cul-de-sac. Michael kept meticulous records. Every letter, every email, every odd interaction was filed into a growing binder. His military discipline served him well. He knew that if this escalated, documentation would be his shield. Still, the emotional toll was immense. Ranger could sense it too. Service dogs are trained to mirror their handler's state, and Michael's tension made Ranger hypervigilant. Walks that once felt like peaceful routines now felt like battlegrounds. Karen's son added another layer of unease. A teenager with a smug grin and a love for pushing boundaries, he began lingering near Michael's driveway, staring at Ranger with an unsettling interest. Once, Michael caught him reaching out to grab the dog's collar without permission. Michael's stern warning sent the boy sulking away, but the look in his eyes, greedy, entitled, unsettled him. It wasn't just Karen anymore. The whole family seemed fixated on Ranger. Meanwhile, Karen's campaign spread beyond her clipboard. She cornered neighbors at block parties, whispering about liability and danger. She hinted that if the HOA didn't act, someone might sue the association. Fear is contagious, and Karen knew how to spread it. Her words turned whispers into rumors, and rumors into suspicion. Michael felt the shift in every glance, every silence that fell when he walked by. Yet, through it all, he refused to break. Ranger was not just his service dog. He was his anchor, his lifeline. To surrender him to Karen's harassment would mean surrendering the fragile normalcy Michael had built. He resolved to stand firm, no matter how suffocating the pressure became. What he didn't know was that Karen's obsession was about to reach its boiling point. Petty notices and gossip would soon give way to something shocking, violent, and utterly unforgivable. An act that would not only wound Ranger, but ignite a legal firestorm that Karen never expected. The tension in the neighborhood thickened like humidity before a storm. Michael could feel it in the way people stopped meeting his eyes, in the long glances that lingered as he and Ranger passed by, and in the polite but cold silences that stretched at gatherings where he was once welcomed. Karen had a gift for reframing reality. To her, rules weren't boundaries that kept order. They were weapons. She wielded them with precision, and Ranger, a dog who had never harmed a soul, became her chosen target. It started with fines. The first one arrived folded in a white HOA envelope, tucked neatly into Michael's mailbox. It accused him of failing to control a large animal in common spaces and cited a rule about maintaining community safety. The fine was small, $50, but the principle behind it was dangerous. Michael photocopied it, added it to his binder, and mailed back a certified response with documentation about service animal rights. He thought that would end the matter. But fines became Karen's new favorite weapon. A week later, another envelope appeared. This one claimed Ranger had barked aggressively at a child. Michael knew the moment referenced. Ranger had barked once, startled by a skateboard slamming onto the pavement. The bark had been protective, not aggressive, and the child had laughed it off. Yet Karen had spun the moment into a narrative of danger. The fine this time was $75. Michael refused to pay. He mailed another letter, this time quoting federal statutes about service dogs. But Karen didn't need him to pay to get what she wanted. Each fine became a seed of doubt she could plant in the minds of board members and neighbors. She began keeping a running tally, presenting the unpaid fines as evidence of Michael's non-compliance. Her campaign expanded. Karen had always carried her clipboard, but now it seemed to follow her everywhere, even to the grocery store. Neighbors began to notice her snapping photos of Ranger during walks, jotting notes furiously whenever the dog so much as sniffed a patch of grass. At one board meeting, she held up a stack of photographs like damning evidence, each one showing Ranger in perfectly ordinary situations. Standing on the sidewalk, sitting near the park bench, lying on Michael's porch. She called them documented instances of violation. A few board members nodded politely, unwilling to challenge her. Others shifted in their chairs, visibly uncomfortable. But no one openly pushed back. Karen's reputation for intimidation had long kept opposition quiet. Even those who disliked her rule feared being her next target. The harassment trickled into Michael's daily life. He noticed neighbors pulling their children closer when Ranger passed, even though the dog padded silently, tail calm and posture steady. He overheard whispers at the community pool about liability and danger. Once, a parent who had previously let her toddler hug Ranger rushed the child away, muttering something about better safe than sorry. Michael bore it silently, relying on discipline to keep himself composed. Every incident went into the binder. Dates, times, witness names if possible. He understood the power of records. If this spiraled into something bigger, he wanted every detail preserved. But even his discipline couldn't erase the slow burn of isolation. Ranger mirrored the stress. Service dogs are trained to sense their handler's emotional state, and Michael's growing anxiety made Ranger more vigilant. The dog began sticking closer during walks, sometimes placing himself between Michael and passing neighbors. His eyes tracked Karen whenever she appeared, ears slightly perked as though recognizing her as a source of tension. Karen, meanwhile, escalated her tactics. Her son became an unsettling extension of her campaign. He was a lanky teenager with a permanent smirk and a hoodie he wore even in warm weather. Michael caught him loitering near his driveway, leaning against the fence, staring at Ranger with a possessive gleam. Once, Michael walked outside to find the boy crouched by the gate, reaching through the slats to stroke Ranger's fur. Michael's voice had been sharp, sharper than he intended. "Get your hands off my dog." The boy flinched, then smiled, not apologetically, but smugly, as though daring him to make an issue of it. He sauntered off, leaving Michael with a prickling unease. The incident made its way into the binder, but unease lingered long after the page was filled. Then came the neighborhood barbecue. Every summer, the cul-de-sac organized a potluck in the park, a cheerful tradition of folding tables laden with hot dogs, potato salad, and pitchers of lemonade. Michael debated whether to attend, knowing Karen would be there. But Ranger had been steady that week, and Michael longed for normalcy. He arrived quietly, set a casserole on the table, and found a seat at the edge of the crowd. For a while, it felt almost normal. Children played tag, neighbors chatted, and Ranger lay calmly at Michael's feet. But Karen's voice cut through the air like a blade. She stood near the center, gesturing toward Michael with a dramatic flair. "We have to be honest about community safety," she declared loudly enough for half the park to hear. "Allowing dangerous animals at events like this puts our children at risk." Michael's chest tightened. He didn't rise to the bait, but eyes turned toward him. Ranger's ears flicked at the shift in mood. A few neighbors glanced sympathetically, but no one spoke in his defense. The silence stung more than the words. By the end of the evening, Michael packed up quietly and left, the casserole dish untouched in his hands. Another note went into the binder. Another evening of normalcy poisoned. The campaign reached new levels in the weeks that followed. Karen filed formal complaints with the HOA, citing repeated disturbances. She claimed Ranger had menaced her son, though witnesses recalled the boy provoking the dog by waving a stick through the fence. She accused Michael of refusing to comply with HOA directives, presenting her growing stack of unpaid fines as evidence. The board scheduled a hearing, one of those tense affairs where residents were invited to speak. Michael arrived with his binder, a thick file of neatly labeled tabs. Karen arrived with her clipboard, her son at her side, smirking as though victory were inevitable. The meeting was a farce. Karen dominated the floor, presenting photos and anecdotes twisted to fit her narrative. Michael responded calmly, citing laws, presenting documents, and even reading from federal statutes that guaranteed his right to have Ranger. A few neighbors murmured agreement, but Karen's allies drowned them out. The board ended the meeting without resolution, promising to review the matter further. Michael left, knowing the outcome had already been decided. Karen would continue her campaign, and the board would do little to stop her. And then, on a blistering summer afternoon, the situation shattered. Michael had taken Ranger to the park for a routine walk. The sky was clear, the grass freshly cut, the air buzzing with cicadas. A few children played nearby, their parents chatting on benches. Michael felt almost relaxed, lulled by the ordinary rhythm. Karen appeared without warning, striding across the lawn with her clipboard under one arm. Her son trailed behind, expression smug. Michael tensed, bracing for another confrontation, another barrage of accusations. But what happened next made every previous encounter in comparison. Karen reached into her bag and pulled out a spray bottle. Before Michael could react, she lifted it and aimed directly at Ranger's face. A sharp mist burst forth, stinging and chemical. Ranger yelped, recoiling, pawing frantically at his eyes. Michael dropped to his knees, shielding the dog, his heart pounding. Around them, gasps erupted. Children screamed. Parents rushed forward. The smell hit Michael's nose. Acrid, caustic. Not water, but some kind of cleaner or pesticide. Rage surged through him, but instinct took over. He shouted for help, called for water, cradled Ranger's head as the dog writhed in pain. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now moved into action. Someone grabbed the spray bottle from Karen's hand. Another called 911. A third ran for bottled water to flush Ranger's eyes. The park that had once been filled with cheerful noise now rang with chaos and outrage. Karen stood frozen, her face a mask of cold defiance. Her son hovered nearby, wide-eyed but grinning faintly, as though this was all some game. Michael didn't waste another second. Scooping Ranger into his arms, he sprinted toward his truck. His hands shook as he fumbled with the keys, his mind racing. The drive to the emergency vet blurred into a haze of panic and fury. Every second felt like an eternity as Ranger whimpered beside him. At the clinic, vets rushed to flush Ranger's eyes and administer treatment. Michael paced the waiting room, fists clenched, replaying the moment over and over. This wasn't harassment anymore. This wasn't gossip or fines. This was violence. And it was the moment that would transform Karen's petty crusade into a federal case. The waiting room at the emergency vet smelled faintly of antiseptic and fear. Michael paced the floor, his boots thudding softly against the tile. Every minute felt like an hour as he replayed the moment again and again. The hiss of the spray bottle, Ranger's agonized yelp, Karen's unflinching face. Finally, a vet emerged. Ranger would recover, she explained, but it would take time. His eyes were irritated and inflamed, though thankfully there was no permanent damage. Hearing that was like air rushing back into Michael's lungs. Relief mingled with fury. Ranger was safe, but the image of him thrashing in pain was burned into Michael's memory. When Michael stepped outside, flashing lights lit up the street. A police cruiser idled at the park entrance, officers speaking with a cluster of neighbors. Karen stood among them, arms crossed, her son shifting uncomfortably at her side. The spray bottle sat sealed inside an evidence bag. Neighbors pointed, gestured, spoke over one another. For once, the crowd wasn't whispering against Michael. They were outraged on his behalf. Parents described how their children screamed when Ranger collapsed. Others repeated Michael's own frantic shouts. One neighbor even admitted to filming the chaos on her phone. The officers separated Karen from the group and began their questioning. She spoke with her usual cold confidence, gesturing dismissively toward Michael. The animal was dangerous. I was protecting the community. But this time, her words rang hollow. Multiple witnesses contradicted her story, describing Ranger as calm and obedient until the moment she sprayed him. The phone footage, shaky but clear, captured Karen raising the bottle and Ranger's immediate cry of pain. The evidence was undeniable. Michael provided his binder, hands trembling but steady enough to pass the thick stack of records. The officers skimmed through pages of notices, fines, and harassment logs. One officer's eyebrows shot up. "You've been documenting this for months?" "Yes," Michael said. His voice was calm, but inside, rage burned like fire. "I knew it would come to this." By the time the police finished their investigation, Karen's composure had cracked. Her son shifted nervously, glancing at the gathering crowd of neighbors who now stared with open hostility. Whispers rippled through the group. Not whispers of fear about Ranger, but disgust aimed squarely at Karen. The officers placed her under arrest. The sound of handcuffs clicking around her wrists was sharp, final. For the first time, Karen looked uncertain, her eyes darting across the crowd as though searching for an ally. None appeared. Her son's smug grin had vanished, replaced by pale shock. Michael stood silently, Ranger leaning against his leg, bandages around his muzzle and eyes. The image of Karen being led to the cruiser was seared into the minds of everyone present. The woman who had ruled the HOA with intimidation was no longer untouchable. But this was only the beginning. The legal system moved swiftly, at least by its usual standards. The assault on Ranger wasn't treated as mere vandalism or property damage. Under federal law, harming a service animal is a serious offense, one that carries fines, restitution, and even prison time. When Karen discovered this, her confidence crumbled. The federal prosecutor assigned to the case contacted Michael within days. "Your documentation is extraordinary," she told him. "It's rare to have such detailed records. This will make a powerful case." Michael handed over the binder, each page a testament to Karen's obsession. The prosecutor flipped through it, shaking her head in disbelief. "She thought she could bully you into submission. Instead, she's handed us a trail of evidence." News spread quickly. Local reporters picked up the story, drawn by the shocking image of a suburban HOA president accused of assaulting a decorated veteran's service dog. Headlines painted Karen not as a protector of order, but as a tyrant who crossed a line. Neighbors who had once been silent now found their voices. They came forward with stories of Karen's intimidation, fines for leaving bicycles on lawns, threats over Christmas decorations, letters about minor landscaping infractions. One resident admitted she had been too afraid to speak until now. "We all knew she was unreasonable," the woman confessed, "but none of us thought she'd go this far." The HOA board scrambled to distance itself. At an emergency meeting, they voted to suspend Karen from her role as president. For the first time in years, residents openly criticized her leadership, emboldened by the sight of her mugshot circulating online. Karen's son was also questioned. Though he hadn't wielded the spray bottle himself, witnesses described his taunts, his provocations, his presence during the attack. The prosecutor considered charges but ultimately focused on Karen, the instigator and authority figure. When the court date arrived, the courtroom filled with neighbors. Some came out of curiosity, others out of a need for closure. Michael sat quietly near the front, Ranger resting obediently at his side, still wearing his vest. The dog's calm presence was a silent reminder of why they were all there. Karen entered in a tailored suit, her hair perfectly styled, but her face pale. Gone was the haughty air of suburban royalty. Her lawyers argued she had acted out of fear, that she believed Ranger posed a danger. But the prosecutor dismantled the claim piece by piece. She projected the video footage onto the courtroom screen. The shaky image showed Karen raising the bottle, the spray erupting, Ranger's immediate yelp. Gasps filled the room. The prosecutor played it twice, letting the horror sink in. Then came the binder. Page after page of harassment, notices, fines, and photographs were entered into evidence. The jury listened as Michael described the months of intimidation, his voice steady but laced with emotion. He spoke of Ranger's role in his recovery, of the trust and dependence that service dog teams require. "She didn't just attack my dog," Michael said quietly. "She attacked my lifeline." The neighbors testified too. Parents described the chaos at the park, children crying as Ranger collapsed. Others spoke of Karen's long history of bullying, her misuse of HOA authority, the way she thrived on fear. Each testimony chipped away at any shred of credibility she had left. Karen's defense faltered. Her lawyers tried to paint her as overzealous but well-meaning, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury saw not a concerned resident, but a woman obsessed with control, willing to cross legal and moral boundaries to enforce her will. The verdict was swift: guilty. Karen's sentencing hearing was the climax everyone in the neighborhood had been waiting for. The judge, a stern woman with years of experience, did not mince words. She cited the federal statute protecting service animals, emphasizing the seriousness of the offense. This court recognizes the vital role service animals play in the lives of veterans and individuals with disabilities. To harm such an animal is not only cruel, it is criminal. The sentence was severe: 6 months in federal prison, fines totaling thousands of dollars, and full restitution for Ranger's medical expenses. Karen was also barred from serving on any HOA board for life. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the sentence was read. Some neighbors exchanged stunned looks, others nodded in satisfaction. Michael sat silently, Ranger pressed against his leg, the weight of justice finally settling over them. Karen was led away in handcuffs once again, her polished exterior shattered. For years she had wielded power unchecked, but now she faced the consequences of her entitlement. Her son watched from the gallery, his smirk gone, his face pale and shaken. The neighborhood would never forget the sight. For Michael, the moment was surreal. He hadn't sought revenge. He hadn't even sought confrontation. All he had wanted was peace. A place where he and Ranger could live quietly, free from harassment. But standing in that courtroom, he realized something larger had been accomplished. Karen's downfall wasn't just about him. It was a warning, a precedent. No HOA president, no neighbor, no petty tyrant could hide behind rules to justify cruelty. The law was clear, and for once it had spoken loudly enough to silence even Karen. As he left the courthouse, neighbors approached him one by one. Some apologized for their silence, admitting they had been afraid to stand up to her. Others thanked him for his perseverance, for refusing to bend. Michael accepted their words with quiet grace, though part of him wished it had never come to this. Ranger, bandages finally removed, walked beside him with steady steps. The golden retriever had endured pain but recovered with resilience. Children who once avoided him now rushed forward to pet his head, their parents smiling, reassured that the danger had never come from him, but from the woman who had tried to destroy him. The climax had been reached, but the story was not yet over. The neighborhood still had to reckon with what had happened, and Michael still had to decide how to move forward. But one truth was undeniable. Karen, the self-proclaimed guardian of order, had fallen, and in her fall, she had exposed the cracks in a system that allowed her to thrive for so long. The courthouse emptied slowly after the sentencing, but for Michael, time seemed to move in a strange, heavy way. He stood outside with Ranger at his side, breathing in the crisp air, trying to process the surreal finality of it all. For months, his life had been a gauntlet of harassment, fear, and simmering anger. Now, in one decisive moment, it had ended. The gavel had come down, and Karen's reign of terror was over. Neighbors lingered nearby, clustered in small groups, their voices hushed but animated. The trial had been a spectacle, but it was also a reckoning. The image of Karen being led away in handcuffs, not once but twice, had shattered the illusion of her authority. The queen of the cul-de-sac had been dethroned, not by whispers or elections, but by the weight of federal law. Michael bent down, ruffling Ranger's fur. The golden retriever's eyes were calm again, the bandages gone, his steady breathing a reminder of resilience. For Michael, that mattered more than anything. Justice had been served, but the real victory was that Ranger was alive, whole, and still by his side. In the days that followed, the neighborhood shifted in ways both subtle and dramatic. Without Karen at the helm, the HOA board scrambled to reorganize. An interim president was elected, a soft-spoken retiree named Mrs. Alvarez, who emphasized fairness and community over punishment. Her first act was to cancel all outstanding fines against Michael, issuing a formal apology on behalf of the board. The apology didn't erase the months of tension, but it marked a turning point. For the first time, Michael felt the board was acknowledging its own complicity. Its silence, its willingness to let Karen bully unchecked. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid him now approached with sheepish smiles. Parents who had pulled their children away from Ranger encouraged them to come say hello. The children ran their small hands through Ranger's golden fur, giggling when he leaned into their touch. Michael allowed it now, grateful for the shift, though he always reminded them gently of the vest's meaning. A few evenings after the sentencing, the neighborhood gathered for another barbecue. This one wasn't like the tense affair of months earlier. The tables were the same, the food familiar, but the atmosphere was different. Lighter, freer. It was as though the entire community had exhaled at once. Michael stood off to the side, plate in hand, Ranger sitting calmly at his feet. One by one, neighbors approached him. Some apologized, confessing they had been afraid to stand against Karen. Others thanked him for his patience, his record-keeping, his refusal to let injustice slide. Michael listened quietly, accepting their words with humility. He wasn't looking for recognition, but he understood that, in a way, his ordeal had freed them too. Karen's absence was more noticeable than her presence had ever been. The once constant sight of her striding with clipboard in hand was gone, leaving a strange emptiness. For years, her shadow had loomed over the neighborhood, dictating lawn heights and mailbox colors, turning every deviation into a battle. Now, without her, the neighborhood slowly began to rediscover what community actually meant. Christmas decorations flourished that winter. Lawns were dotted with reindeer, strings of lights draped across roofs, inflatable Santas waving from porches. For the first time in years, no one feared receiving a letter about non-compliance. Children left bicycles on driveways without fines appearing in mailboxes. The small freedoms felt intoxicating. But there was also shame. At HOA meetings, residents admitted how long they had tolerated Karen's bullying, how they had allowed fear to silence them. The realization was sobering. One man, a father of 3, stood up and said, "We should have stood with Michael sooner. It shouldn't have taken something like this for us to act." Heads nodded around the room. The acknowledgement was painful but necessary. Meanwhile, Karen herself became the talk of the town in a very different way. Local news outlets covered her sentencing extensively, painting her as a cautionary tale. The once proud HOA president was now a convicted criminal. Reporters unearthed her history of complaints, her long string of battles with neighbors, her obsession with control. Her family withdrew into silence. Her son, once cocky and smirking, was rarely seen outside. Rumors circulated that he had been sent to live with relatives out of embarrassment. Karen's husband, who had rarely been involved in her crusades, put their house up for sale within months. The cul-de-sac that Karen once ruled became the place she fled from in disgrace. For Michael, the schadenfreude was hollow. He hadn't wanted Karen destroyed. He had wanted peace. But as he watched her family's for sale sign rise on their lawn, he couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The chapter was ending. The neighborhood could heal. On a personal level, Michael and Ranger's bond deepened. The ordeal had tested them both. Ranger physically, Michael emotionally. Yet they had come through stronger. Ranger's training shone during the darkest moments, his steadiness reminding Michael to breathe, to endure. And Michael's unwavering defense had ensured Ranger's safety, proving that their partnership was more than legal. It was unbreakable. Veterans organizations reached out to Michael after the story hit the news. They praised his perseverance, using his case as an example in training seminars about service dog rights. Some even invited him to speak, to share his story with others who faced similar harassment. Michael, never one for the spotlight, hesitated at first, but eventually, he agreed. If his experience could help even one other veteran protect their service animal, it was worth it. In those talks, he emphasized 2 things: the importance of knowing your rights and the importance of documentation. "I didn't win because I shouted louder," he would say. "I won because I kept records. Every letter, every fine, every photo went into that binder. When the time came, it wasn't my word against hers, it was facts against lies." His binder, once a symbol of stress, became a symbol of resilience. The broader impact rippled outward. HOAs in nearby communities reviewed their policies, wary of becoming the next cautionary headline. Some boards implemented training on ADA compliance, ensuring members understood the rights of service animal handlers. Lawyers who specialized in disability rights cited Michael's case in seminars, using it to remind organizations that federal law always overrides local rules. Even neighbors in other towns shared the story on social media, often with captions like, "HOA presidents, take note, you don't mess with service dogs." Karen's name became shorthand for entitlement gone too far. Online forums about HOAs and neighborhood disputes used her case as an example of what happens when power is abused. "Don't be a Karen" took on a very specific meaning in those circles, a warning against bullying under the guise of community rules. For Michael, the greatest change was internal. For months he had lived under a cloud of suspicion, forced to defend himself against baseless accusations. The stress had reopened old wounds, feeding the anxiety that Ranger was meant to ease. But after the trial, after the sentencing, something shifted. The weight lifted. He could walk Ranger through the neighborhood without scanning for hostile eyes. He could attend barbecues without bracing for confrontation. He could live, simply live, in peace. He still carried scars, of course. Trauma doesn't vanish overnight. Loud noises still startled him. Crowds still made his chest tighten. But Ranger was there, steady as always. And now, their place in the neighborhood was secure, protected not only by law, but by the newfound respect of their community. Months later, on a quiet spring morning, Michael sat on his porch sipping coffee. Ranger lay at his feet, the sun warming his fur. Across the street, children rode bicycles, laughter ringing through the air. For the first time in a long time, Michael allowed himself to feel at home. His neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, strolled by with a wave. "Good morning, Michael," she called. "How's Ranger doing today?" "Strong as ever," Michael replied, scratching the dog's ear. Ranger thumped his tail in agreement. Mrs. Varez smiled. "We're lucky to have you both here." Michael nodded, a quiet smile spreading across his face. For all the chaos, for all the pain, the outcome had been worth it. He and Ranger had stood their ground, and in doing so, they had not only defended themselves but reshaped the entire community. The takeaway was clear. Entitlement, when left unchecked, can grow into cruelty. Rules, when weaponized, become tools of oppression. But resilience, patience, and truth are stronger. Michael and Ranger's story was no longer just theirs. It was a reminder to every veteran, every person with a disability, every quiet neighbor facing a bully in a position of power. You are not powerless. The law is on your side. And sometimes all it takes is the courage to stand firm, the discipline to keep records, and the strength to fight back when no one else will. Karen had tried to strip Michael of his peace. In the end, she had only stripped herself of her freedom. And Michael? He finally had what he wanted all along. Peace.